Hello, it's David and Brent this week. It's halfway through February 14th, 2 weeks through the crop insurance price discovery period. This week, we're talking about trend yields is the first thing we have talked about. So, Brent, I added two new questions to the forecast network. The first one is, what's the probability of the November 2020 WASD report? So, a long ways from now, 8 months from now. What's the probability of that report, 9 months, I guess? What's the probability of that report having the U.S. corn yield for 2020 above 177 bushels per acre and soybeans above 49.5? So a couple articles also accompanying those, supplementing that, and that's where trend yields look to be in that neighborhood, 177 for corn, 49.5 for soybeans. Seems like a big number, but probably the starting point for the USDA as we start to make those early WASDE projections for the upcoming growing season.
Yeah, those are some big numbers. And, that, David and and you talk about this, I think, in the article about, USDA's approach to estimating that trend yield is a little bit different than the approach we're using. And historically, it's produced maybe just a little slightly higher number on corn for sure. So I would expect that trend yield number will be right around, it's going to be close to your number. It may be just a freckle higher. But as we were talking before, you start putting those kinds of yields into the balance sheet, and we start to end up with some really big corn production numbers that we're going to have to work through. So I think it's something that we definitely have to think about from a risk management standpoint for sure.
So yeah, we start with the trend, and we'll talk about corn here. 177. It's a lot bigger than the 167, 168 we had for 2019 production. So it seems like a big uptick. But the thing to keep in mind is the way history since the 1980s has played out is above trend yields actually occur a majority of the time. So for corn, about 66% of the time, historically speaking, we've had above trend yields. So if you just sort of ignored any weather or ignored any other information right now, to answer that question, what's the probability of having above 177 corn yield here in the U.S. for 2020? 66% is a starting point. For soybeans, above trend happens about 53% of the time. So as you mentioned, Brent, big numbers or big yields to start with these early WASDE reports. Actually, the May WASDE report's the first one that looks at 2020/2021 marketing year. So that 177 is probably going to be where the USDA plants its first flag. And then history would suggest there's actually a pretty good probability of us going above that over time.
Yeah, a lot of times we forget that the way the math works out. When we're above, we're not above as much as when we're below. So on average, we're above more than we're below, and that's why the probabilities work out that way. So I think it's definitely something to get your attention, those kinds of numbers. I think we got lulled a little bit last year with the low yields, but those kind of numbers put some big bushels on the balance sheet.
Yes, no, it's important to keep in mind that trend yields is a couple bushel per acre, and it over every year it grinds away and keeps pushing yields higher, and it's easy to sort of lose sight of that, especially in the short run from year to year. Go ahead, Brent.
Yeah, and at the same time, you have to also admit or take note of the fact that it is extremely wet through much of the Corn Belt right now. So, there's that kind of mitigating factor that, we just don't know exactly how the weather is going to play out. It appears to be set up pretty wet heading into the spring. So there's a lot of different kind of mitigating factors going on right now. I think it's setting up for a potentially wild ride.
Yeah, and so the goal here is what's the base rate? It's always important to start with what's the base rate. 177 looks like a base rate for yield, and then we can think about how does that how does that historically play out? And then you make adjustments from there. So if you think the wet year is going to be a headwind, you can make adjustments lower, or maybe it's going to be a positive story if it stops raining.
Right.
The other thing I want to encourage listeners to review, and I lost sight of this, sort of a forest for the trees situation. Soybean, we have a question in the forecast platform about the probability of the November soybean contract falling below $9 a bushel before August 1st. And we're right around 9.25 right now, about a 50 cents per bushel decline over the last 6 weeks. I had to update my forecast as I hadn't updated as we tick lower every week there. And so encourage you to, 25 cents in soybeans could be a day or two of trading. So probably more, I guess, I put the probability of that event happening higher today than I had 6 weeks ago. And so I encourage others to look at that and consider that as well.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, if you look at soybeans recently, they've gained about 12 cents in February, which is the other thing, I think we got to keep in mind right now that soybean corn price ratio is somewhere around 2.35, which is I would say not extremely supportive of huge corn acres, but not, it's kind of in the middle range, right?
That's the average, sort of a long run average that we've seen.
Yeah. So, I think it's right now the signal from insurance is not to go crazy on corn. And I know I was telling David before, I just ran some numbers for soybeans and corn on our farm, and it's not as favorable to corn as I would have guessed before I did it. So something to keep in the back of your mind as well.
Well, and also keep in mind, Brent, that it's not as favorable to corn as it was, let's say, in the long run. But it is much more favorable to corn than where we were in 2017 and 2018, when we planted about 50% soybeans and 50% corn. And so there's sort of this time frame that we got to keep in mind. So, two economists can have this conversation and say, it's less, not as favorable to corn as we think it is, or it's much more favorable to corn. And the important relevance is what's the time frame we're looking at. So we were close to 2.48, almost 2.5 when we were at a 50-50 split between those acres. And so we're not expecting a 50-50 split, right? It's going to be a big back away from there, but not what it was when we were buying a lot of corn in the ethanol boom era.
Right. Yeah. I just don't. Yeah. It would take a big run up in soybean prices to get us to parity with corn acres. But it's not as negative as it was, the last time we planted, high 90 million acres either. So.
Right. So we also have a link to share. It's on the Forecast Network overview page. We'll include a link here, but it's from Bridgewater Capital, a good summary of how they're thinking about the corona. Not that it's a few weeks old. I guess it's a week and a half old now. So some of the numbers have increased and been more updated, but I'll let Brent, summarize this a little bit, but I think it's a good framework for thinking about how that might play out.
Yeah, they did. I thought they did a nice job of kind of laying out some rational thinking about, how do you even approach evaluating what the impact of the coronavirus is. And so take a read of it. They kind of walk through, the infection rate and the mortality rate and how to, just how to think about it. It continues to get a lot of news coverage, and if you're so inclined, you can find all kinds of crazy conspiracy stuff out there to look at as well. But I think at this point, try and use some kind of rational thinking on it. But what is compounding in my mind all the uncertainty is we just don't want to believe what the Chinese are telling us. And I think that's the biggest thing right now is there's just nobody knows. Nobody seems to really know what the heck is going on over there. And like I've been saying for a while, to me, continue to watch that cruise ship, and because it's not in China, and we kind of know what the population was on the ship, and we can get a pretty good idea of, just how many people are getting it, as well as how many people end up dying from that. And so far, I think that's encouraging in the sense that, there haven't been, I think maybe one person in Japan has died from that. So I think that's a little more encouraging than some of the news you get out of China. But it's also pretty infectious because the number on that ship has been increasing pretty rapidly. So it's clearly going to have a big impact on some markets. Oil, for sure, is going to be impacted by this in a big way, as are some of the other economic indicators, GDP growth and other things. I think it's having a big impact.
So one of the numbers that jumped out to me from this Bridgewater article is the virus reproductive number. And so it's the number of cases that occur from one case. And so they've estimated it at 2.2. And we've talked about this before. That's just how infectious it is. So for every one case, there's 2.2 additional cases. And as a reference, influenza, the flu, is usually 1.2 to 1.8. And SARS was also around this 2.2. And so when you think about why the Chinese government, or why the government in China has put these quarantines in place, is they want to try to reduce that multiplier, get that closer to 1 or less than 1 if possible. So that was just an interesting piece of information from this report that helped put some pieces together in my thinking and my logic.
Yeah, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's worth reading. It's short and it's kind of to the point. I thought it was a good piece of information.
Any other forecasts you're looking at and thinking about, Brent?
Right now in my mind, this the corn price thing, I'm really conflicted on it. As to what, where things are going to go. So I'm continuing to evaluate that one carefully, because I can just see, you can kind of make cases either way. And I think it's just a really important time to be rational and kind of try and, really think through all the different factors and try and use judgment as opposed to getting emotional about it, because there's a lot of stuff flying around either way. I mean, the coronavirus, the planning, the wet spring. I mean, there's just tons of stuff right now, and lots and lots of uncertainty.
Yeah, we talk a lot about pros and cons. I've been thinking about what are bullish scenarios and what are bearish scenarios. And if you start to weave a story together that has all these bullish factors that have to go right, that's probably not saying it couldn't happen. It's just recognizing that, when I get to this conclusion, I have to weave all these independent bullish factors or independent bearish factors together to reach that set of conclusions.
Right.
Well, thanks for joining us this week. That's all we have to share. We'll look forward to chatting with you again next week.
Thank you.